All right. Hey, everyone. So, trying something new today. As some of you may know, I've been writing a decent bit this year around what I've called a series of one daily thoughts, which have tried to be posts that just basically convey one fairly simple, straightforward idea and do it in a kind of brief 300 to 400-ish word format. So I did that for, I guess, close to 3 months, and I really enjoyed it. I think it was fun and valuable, but end of the day, I think what I was trying to just figure out, how do I try to get the word out and try to share information as succinctly as possible with as many people as possible. It's just hard to get people to read stuff these days. That's just the reality of it, and you probably feel that yourself. It's hard to get yourself to read anything these days, and so as much fun as I have writing, I think there's other ways to get information out there, and so that's why I'm showing up here on video. So what I want to do with this is just kind of talk through a piece that I just posted today, and just basically cover the same content in audio video format. So this is a bit longer than those 300 to 400 word pieces. I think I'm going to try now to shift to a format where I do one post each week along with a video like this. So with that said, let's dive in. So the topic today is as the media crumbles. And what I wanted to do with this is bring up a lot of what I would say is fairly clear evidence that the media, and I'll define media in the piece, but broadly speaking, you could think of it as mass media or legacy media, basically the institutions that have, over the course of the 20th century, become the primary sources of information for us. So this would include things like ABC, CBS, NBC, New York Times, Washington Post, kind of anything in that bucket of newspapers, TV channels, journalists, etc. And obviously, Fox News as well, though they come out from a different angle, which we'll talk to a little bit. But that all said, that's what we're kind of defining as the media. And what I wanted to bring up, this was actually precipitated in part by some polling numbers that I had seen that kind of bring this really to light. And so Gallup has been, which is a very respectable polling organization, has been doing polls on the public's trust in the media basically over the last 20 years. And they also have this broken out by party identification. So I share this graph in the article, and I'll link to that. But broadly speaking, what we've seen since they started tracking this in 1997 is that the trust in what they call mass media, and what we talked about, has declined fairly substantially, all the way up until 2015. And this is why I honestly really need to see the graph to see what I think we can pretty clearly state is the Trump effect, which is in 2015, 2016, between those two timeframes, Republican trust in the media dropped by about 15 percentage points, from 30% to 14%. And Democrats' trust in the media jumped from 51% all the way up to 72%. Now, it's interesting to note that the level of trust in the media has always gone in order of Democrats trust it the most, independents trust it in the middle, and Republicans trust it the least. But the delta between these two groups, and actually all three groups, has never been larger than it is right now. What we have as of 2019 is that 69% of Democrats trust the media, 36% of independents, and only 15% of Republicans trust the media. So when you average that all together, the trust in the media is sitting nationally at 41%, which I think is worth noting because, and even for me, obviously, sharing this video, saying that you don't trust the media doesn't have a good connotation with it. Kind of brings to mind calls of fake news or, a bunch of different views that range from just weird to conspiratorial crackpot. But what this polling data shows is certainly when, it's just anonymous and you don't feel a social pressure to say, oh yes, of course I believe, the information that's being put out there by these esteemed institutions. Most people don't trust the information that's being put out there by these esteemed institutions. And that, is a problem, and we should all be worried about that and want that to get better. Whether or not, again, you think that institutions have a bias, and I think we'll get into this, but I think it's pretty clear that there's evidence of that. We should want institutions that provide unbiased and complete information, because we should all want unbiased and complete information, because we make better decisions with unbiased and complete information. So, there's a lot to this, right? This is a very complex topic, and, looking at it is not easy just because there are so many different viewpoints, and obviously whatever your political orientation is, you will have your own perspective on this, and, again, polling data shows quite clearly that that's going to be very different in all likelihood if you're a Democrat or a Republican. I'm approaching this as neither, but I'm also approaching this as someone who doesn't really trust the media, and I, state that in what's going on, and I, want to be clear about that, again, because of these sort of biases you may have when you hear someone say that. The media does share a lot of facts that are, obviously accurate, and it's not, I'm not the one sitting here saying, fake news, obviously, when, about Trump's crowd size or about, fill in the blank, right? I think the media does generally get a lot of these straight facts right, or if not, those situations kind of inevitably are straightened out, because not all facts are, perfectly able to be determined, or, some I should say are arguable, basically. But, I think we generally, with the internet and with the amount of which information can spread and be shared by many people, get to the bottom of things like that. But what is going on, and Sam Harris and Eric Weinstein recently did a podcast on it where they cover this really well, is that the media is trafficking in what we can call narratives, right? Which are these sort of grand story arcs that all these institutions have built up over time. And even, every human does this. Every human builds up a narrative about themselves, about their lives over time. We naturally relate to stories. And I had covered that in a previous piece. But we all do this. Any company does this, right? If you're building a product, there's a mythos and ethos about the company and the product, and you're bringing it to light. And that's in part how companies survive, and media institutions are companies, obviously. So, that all said, what we do see with these media institutions is that they're working within their narrative, and they're sharing information, basically, or framing that information in ways that support that narrative. So, an example, a silly one that we'll get into, is that, the New York Times, and I have, again, a screenshot of this in the article, but in 2016 had an article praising Hillary Clinton for her choice of a white pantsuit. And then in 2019, a few days ago, criticized Tulsi Gabbard for wearing a white pantsuit and said it was, quote, chilling. So that, obviously those are real pieces of information, but what's really going on here, I think it should be pretty clear. The New York Times didn't do a 180 on whether or not they think that women should wear white pantsuits in presidential debates. I don't know why anyone should care what women or men are wearing in presidential debates. But that does beg the question, why did the New York Times write an article about that? And the inevitable answer is, right, that they were framing those facts of what Tulsi Gabbard and Hillary Clinton were wearing in the subset of their narrative, which was that Hillary Clinton was a candidate who was kind of fully on board with their narrative, supporting it 100% their way. She was their candidate, and so it's great that she was wearing a white pantsuit. And then when Tulsi Gabbard does it, Gabbard has been critical of a lot of the sort of foundational institutions of the left. And so she's an enemy of their narrative, even though she's still running as a Democrat, and still, if you look at her policies, actually, is Democratic, by, again, kind of modern political standards. She's not with their narrative. She's against them. And so the facts are framed in a way that attack her. So with that all said, again, I'm not here to talk about white pantsuits, but these institutions are working with their narratives, and they naturally will choose information that fits their narrative to highlight and promote. And this has been exacerbated, I guess there's some piece, by this, sort of called clickbait, ad-driven media model, right? And I don't have time to get into the full details of that, but basically put the incentives around the monetary incentives of providing news right now are focused on getting people's attention and show them ads. And because of that, you're highly, highly incented to show information that people will want to click on and read, which we've kind of naturally discovered are things that provoke outrage, provoke a sense of unity with your team or with the sort of coalition or narrative that you're a part of. And so all these, basically, all these news organizations at some point faced a choice, and it wasn't necessarily a binary point in time or a singular point in time where they had to choose, do I go with the narrative or I share an unbiased perspective? But what we've seen evolve over time is pretty clearly that all these organizations have opted for the latter, or for the, sorry, not the latter, the former, opted for the route of sharing things that support their narrative and becoming narrative-driven organizations rather than unbiased paragons of truth and virtue. And again, if anyone's worked in a corporate environment and you remove the politics and the exact companies of this, that also shouldn't really surprise anyone. Companies have a really strong bias for self-preservation. And this action of jumping towards narrative-driven storytelling and catering to your audience is purely self-preservation of the entity. There's not one single person at any of these companies, I can almost promise you that, sitting there twirling their mustache and saying, oh, well, how can we be, not evil, but how can we, further this narrative? There are people who have perspectives, but everything is being driven. It's a culture, right, within the companies, and everything's being driven by that culture, and that culture is strongly incented by self-preservation. And so, again, I think if you remove the politics from it, and, you can see this actually if you look at the polling numbers, and, I think the Democrats' current support of the media is actually pretty clearly artificially inflated. Because if you see, aside from where Republicans went, and, you can say that's very likely biased too. If you look at independents, their trust in media is actually closer to the Republicans' level. It's 36%, and it jumped very slightly when Trump got elected, but it's since kind of come back down. And actually, between 2018 and 19, trust in media across all three groups dropped by 6%. So it I think is becoming more and more clear to people, and I think it'd be, again, a good thing if it becomes much more mainstream over the next couple years for people to say, I don't trust the media. And I think we need to get to that point so that things can change. And so that's, kind of the last bit of the piece is I try to frame it as what can we do about it? Because I think there was a saying I saw recently, and I think it's something I am really going to live by. It's very easy to tear something down. It's a lot harder to build something back up. And so, it's very easy to criticize things. It's very easy to say things are broken. But that doesn't solve anything, right? And so, I think to talk about what we want to do about it, right? The one main issue, and that really worries me is that there's a movement afoot that recognizes this and says, oh, hey, if we just start to regulate speech or regulate what's on social media, censor things, have them share what's true and what's, friendly, then everything will be okay. And I think this is called gatekeeping, right? We want someone to be gatekeeper, sort of filter out a lot of information down to discrete information that presents a singular story. And this is basically what we had when we just had, three cable or, three national news networks on TV, right? They were gatekeeping, and, there's a lot of evidence actually, like during the Vietnam War, they worked very closely with the government to kind of confirm certain narratives. And actually, that's probably about when that was first broken, because there was such, a pushback on certain areas. But we can't go back to a world of gatekeeping, no matter how much anyone wants us to. The internet's simply too powerful. Technology these days is too powerful. And, I think if you look at the places where there is kind of gatekeeping, the strongest example, right, of that is North Korea. And even that, and I linked to it in the piece, there's an organization called Flash Drives for Freedom that's literally smuggling flash drives of information of, not propaganda, but just, well, I mean, anything described as propaganda if you want, but basically sneaking information in to combat North Korean propaganda, and on flash drives, right? And there's a huge appetite for this, as far as I'm aware, in North Korea. So, even in the most extreme case that we have today, it's just not possible to shut down the free flow of information, or semi-free flow of information. And even if it was, I think I want to be very clear about this, because this is where a lot of people on the left, I think especially, are just really dangerously off base. We don't want to have a centralized source of information. That's going to invite tyranny and oppression and a lot of things that, is not going to work out, even if you fully trust the guy in charge. And obviously, right now, like, everyone knows I'm not a big fan of Donald Trump by any means. I'm not a fan of Donald Trump by any means. It should be clear that you're not going to always have the guy or woman in control that you want. There can be a lot of bad, crazy people out there, and politics brings them out, and they're probably going to be in office. So you want a system that protects the people against bad people being in office, because they are going to get there, no matter what you do. Because some people really like power and will do whatever it takes to get it. So that's not an answer, right? Hopefully that's clear. What could be an answer is kind of a distributed, decentralized, blockchain type approach. And I don't go into this too much in the piece. I think it's really interesting to think about. I'm far from an expert on blockchain technology, but you could envision some type of system, right, where there are sort of credits given and provided to people on the basis of their information, and if something is found to be deemed false, and maybe that's by some sort of anonymous, decentralized jury system, right, where things could be challenged and sent to an anonymous jury of maybe 12, could be 100 people. They decide whether or not that information or story is false, and if it is false or if it is misleading, then that person loses some amount of reputation. And again, this is, I'd say, certainly a ways off from being codified. There are actually several organization media sort of social networks starting to work on this concept. So Brave is a web browser that operates on a basic attention token that people can basically get and then tip to certain news sites, or tip based on where they focus, as a way to replace the ad-driven model. And then Minds is a social network that actually has something somewhat analogous to this jury system, but more for things that would be deemed infractions or violations of terms of service. And I think, again, that's kind of, I think in both senses, a model of where this could go. But unfortunately, all this, I think, it's still going to be at least probably 5 years, probably more like 10 or 20 years away from reaching a state of maturity. The speed of change is increasing in the world, but it still just takes a lot of time for something to get to the size of, a Facebook or, a Twitter or YouTube to have a decent amount of influence over things. So in the meantime, I think the answer almost certainly has to be cultural. And that's hard. I've written about culture before. Basically, you don't control it. No one controls it. But we all actually, paradoxically, do have some amount of control over it. It's controlled by everyone and by no one at the same time. And, need to try to engender is a culture that values truth and accuracy over the success of a team. And we're, I'd say, pretty much at the antithesis of that currently. We have a lot of people out there who really want their team to win and will basically slap truth and accuracy in the face in order to make that happen. And as those two sides, I mean, this is, increasing bipartisanship, et cetera, but as those two sides get more and more devoted to their team winning and slapping truth and accuracy in the face, to continue with that analogy, this is only going to get worse because it's going to lead to these news organizations, whether it's Fox News on the right or MSNBC or CNN on the left, or fill in the blanks with newspapers, etc. They're going to continue to cater to the most vociferous audience that they can. And so then the news is going to get worse. It's going to encourage more and more people to try to pick sides. And we need a cultural shift to focus a real primacy on truth seeking. And candidly, shame people who slap truth or accuracy in the face, for the success of their team. And, again, with culture, it's not something that anyone can just snap their fingers and change overnight. It's something that we all have to start to buy into and start to convince other people of buying into. I'd never like when the answer, at least for a 5-10 year period, is just, well, it's cultural and we all have to start to change ourselves in some way. But unfortunately, I don't think that there's an overnight solution to this. And to me, that's kind of the clearest place that we can start. I don't think there's policy changes that can help us find the truth better. That's just not something that you can ever trust a centralized source to do. And that's kind of the libertarian in me. But I think if you look again at who's going to become in charge of the government, again, no matter what side you're on, if you're on the left, picture a Trump, who has full control over what's shared on all media networks. And if you're on the right, picture it being Obama or Elizabeth Warren having full control. And you have to consider that possibility. And this was written about in the Federalist Papers. So it's not a new idea. We need to focus on what's going to happen when the people you don't want to have power do. And our Constitution is built for that, and that's a good thing. But we need to also make sure that as a culture, we give a shit about that. So, so that's the video. It turned out to be a bit longer than I thought. I will be pleasantly shocked if anyone sits through the full 23 minutes here. But I hope you found this interesting. I really enjoy this stuff, obviously. And I would love to hear your thoughts. So if you have any, I'm sure you do, leave a comment or shoot me an email, make it known. So, that's it, and have a good day, everyone.